Welcome to the talk show. It's my pleasure to have as my guest Robert Harris, who is one of the legendary novelists of our time. 16 novels, 6 of them to do with the Roman Empire. He is an extraordinary force looking at power, friendship, morality in government, morality out of government, the king of the page turner who makes history come alive with a speed, a narrative, an urgency, but most of all, which is why he sold 20 million plus books, an enjoyment and entertainment. He began his life in Nottingham, born into a council house. He has risen, rather like Anthony Trollope, to become a man who has ridden the crest of the wave of literature. Robert Harris, it's my pleasure to have you here today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Geordie. That's quite a build-up. I hope I can live up to it.
I hope so. Tell me, with Agrippa, your latest book, it is a book about friendship and power and how the two coincide. Was that what attracted you? And give us a brief resume of Agrippa, who never became emperor, but was connected to power and was in many ways a power broker.
Yes, I mean, there was an extraordinary partnership, one of the most consequential friendships in history. Agrippa came from a fairly poor background, obscure. Octavius, who later became Augustus, the emperor, he came from obviously an aristocratic background. For some reason, they were both educated together, which was surprising. They got to know one another as teenagers. They went into the army at the same time. Octavius was Caesar's great nephew, and to his surprise and that of Agrippa, he was made Caesar's heir. And so you have this position where these two 18-year-olds by then face the question of whether they go and try and claim this inheritance or not. They did. They were complementary characters. Agrippa was, if you see a picture of him, he's a brooding, heavy-set man, and Octavius, by all accounts, was rather feeble, weak, often ill, and they relied on one another. Agrippa relied upon Caesar for the name, because he took the name Caesar, and Augustus relied upon Agrippa for his organizational talents and his military skill.
And you take us through a memoir written by Agrippa towards the end of his life, when he's looking back and assessing where he went wrong, where he went right, the adventure of the whole life, but also there's a tension again between power and friendship.
Yes, I mean, I think it's very difficult to mix the two. The demands of power mean a certain ruthlessness. People have to be discarded. Loyalty can finish you if you're over loyal. And of course, there is inevitably at this level rivalry. I think that Agrippa had to be very, very careful. He never had a triumph, despite the fact he was the great military genius of the age. He never had a triumph. He had to be very careful not to get out ahead of the boss. And I think that Augustus must have feared him in some way because he was so effective and commanded the legions, and probably resented him to a degree. There was an added complicated factor in that Agrippa had no difficulty fathering children. He had 8 in the end, whereas Augustus, like his great uncle, only had one daughter, Julia. He needed male heirs, and Agrippa was brought in to provide them effectively. He married Augustus married him off to his niece first, and then to Julia, his daughter. So it's a very rich subject for a novelist. The playing field is enormous. It's the whole world, but locked at the heart of it are these two personalities.
And how did you simplify? Because as we've just demonstrated, it's a complex interrelationship. There's family, there's power, there's an element of people trying to piggyback onto power or to catapult themselves over somebody else. As the novelist, what was the key point which you thought, this is the way in?
Well, the key thing, I think, was to decide early on to make it an autobiography. I mean, Agrippa may have written some kind of memoir, but it's lost. this gave me the opportunity to tell his story in his voice. And the moment you're telling it in a voice, then you could begin to get a sense of the man. And I think his tone would have been clipped, military, no nonsense, and that's the style in which the book is written. And essentially, it goes through the great highlights of his life, chief among them his building of the Roman navy, defeating the pirates on Sicily, which was a huge operation, and then most famously of all, defeating Antony and Cleopatra at the great naval battle of Actium, which is one of the hinges of modern history.
And did you feel, as you looked back on this history thousands of years ago, the relevance to today? And modern world is now dominated by some very strong male leaders, from Trump, Erdogan, Putin, Xi. What did you learn from looking back there and looking at today? Because just to remind the listeners that you started as a political reporter, you became the novelist with Fatherland, which transformed the thriller and transformed your life. You then also became the political and literary analyst through reviews, which were more than reviews. They were sort of sometimes takedowns, sometimes they were truths which were hard to put, but you were always ruthless in pursuing what you thought was candor.
Yes, I mean, for me, novel writing is really journalism in another form, by which I mean that the preoccupations I had as a journalist were with power and politics and the forces that shape everything. And I found that it was better for me to do this through the forces of the imagination rather than through journalism. I'm not comparing myself, but Orwell said he wanted to turn political writing into an art by creating characters and stories, and that's, in a sense, that's kind of what I aspire to do. And if you want to look at power, really you can do little better than to go to the Roman world, because it's all stripped down and simple, and you can get into the inside of it without looking like you're trying to write a roman à clef, which it would be if you tried to invent a British Prime Minister or a president. And I think the crucial thing about this novel, Agrippa, is that it is at the point when the old Roman democracy, the Republic, collapsed and was replaced by a whole new system, which was essentially the strongman system. The old Roman Republic worked on the principle of dividing power, containing it, 2 consuls alternating monthly, only elected for a year, subject to challenge in the courts. The whole of the Roman Republic approach to power was to stop the emergence of a dictator or a king. That ended with Julius Caesar, and thereafter, once those rules had been swept away, you arrived in a completely different world of just, survival of the fittest.
Dictatorship, essentially.
Yeah, essentially dictatorship. Vastly wealthy rulers. I mean, Trump said to have made $2 billion since he became president. Well, Augustus, he took Spain, and in his first year, having taken it, he received 7 tons of gold from the Spanish mines. So the idea was that you became very, very rich. That gave you strength, and that was the way the system worked. And all the old checks and balances. There was a facade of democracy. There were still elections. There was still a Senate. There were still debates. But really, the power all resided in the hands of one man.
And what do you think it's drawn you to? I mean, the ruthless power is what I see dominating as the themes of your books, as we've gone from Hitler with Fatherland through to different prime ministers, through to different emperors, through to ex-prime ministers. It's power. What dictates that interest for you?
Well, and again, I'm not comparing myself, but Shakespeare, he showed the way that you could write very interestingly about the characters of kings, or indeed Julius Caesar, and at the same time, it had huge implications. So the lifting of a little finger, as it were, ripples across the empire. And I find it quite interesting to write about the pressures on individuals, because they are, after all, human beings who occupy these positions, The thirst for power, the paranoia when you're there, can you hold on to it? The rivalries, and the sense in the end that it always ends in failure. I mean, however powerful you are, you die in the end, or you fall out of fashion. There are so many pitfalls and problems. And these rules of power are universal and timeless. And it seems to me what happened to Caesar and Augustus and Agrippa, we can see played out today.
Well, let's look at the politicians you've been up close with and had friendships with, and then fell out, notably over the Iraq War with Tony Blair. Was it a very close friendship in the beginning, and what happened?
No, it wasn't. I'm not trying to claim that we were best friends. I was writing a column on the Sunday Times, main political column. Tony Blair became shadow spokesman on employment, I think it was, and he invited me out for lunch. This was in 1992, I think, and we got on very well, and I found him very refreshing. And he wanted to encourage me to write speeches for him and get him more involved. I didn't want to do that. That was the year that my first novel, Fatherland, came out. But I did return to the Sunday Times. He was by then leader of the Labour Party. And, we fell into a closer liaison. And in fact, he asked me to accompany him during the 1997 general election campaign, which I did.
As a reporter?
Yeah, traveling, but it was more than that because I traveled with him and his staff. I mean, I didn't have a press badge. I had a leaders of the opposition's office kind of badge. So on the planes and on the helicopters and all the rest of it, I was by his side. I was by his side when the election result came in 97, when he got a landslide.
So you were part of Team Blair?
Yes, and I think I was rather regarded that. Yeah. And my wife and I were among his first ever dinner guests at Chequers. So I was close. So if you see what I mean, I'm saying it was to a degree a transactional relationship, but we got on well.
It was close. In terms of journalism and politics, that's close.
Yeah, too close.
The fallout was quite intense over possibly the biggest moral judgment of a Prime Minister in our lifetime.
Yes. The Iraq War was something I was against strongly from the beginning. I had my very first book with Jeremy Paxman. It was a history of chemical and biological warfare. So the way that they were what Saddam Hussein had was being hyped up as if it was the equivalent of nuclear weapons, I thought was specious, because they're not. And
but I want to stick to the friendship and power.
Yeah.
So how did you realize that this immensely powerful person, who most people move towards power, was something which you were not going to countenance?
Well, I think the prime ministers, after a while, begin to lose touch with reality. It certainly happened with Margaret Thatcher. Often the most successful prime ministers who seem to have the greatest feel for the country are the ones that then seem to lose this. And I think I remember talking to one of Blair's closest associates, who said after the Kosovo business and the chanting of Tony, Tony, when he appeared in the refugee camps, he thought he could walk on water. And there were other circumstances. He'd rather had to farm off domestic policy to Gordon Brown, a slightly Agrippa-like relationship, this actually. Agrippa, blunt, direct, like Brown, brooding, and then the charming, younger, slighter front man. There was definitely something of the Agrippa-Augustus relationship between the two of them. And I think that it suited a certain messianic quality in Tony Blair's temperament to take moral leads. And he had a black and white view of morality. And But
it wasn't your view?
No, my view is not that.
How did it end?
My friendship with him?
Yes. Was it a public column or was it a private word?
Well, we tried to. I continued to write my column, as you say, pretty directly and bluntly, and then there was a definite foie d'oeil, and we both found ourselves at Roy Jenkins's funeral, and he said, "Come on, we should get together." And we went to dinner in Downing Street, my wife and I, just with Tony and Cherie, and which was perfectly pleasant, and that was the year of the Iraq invasion. And but things were going wrong. You know, it was clear that this gamble was failing badly.
Was that a topic of dinner?
It was brought up by Chirac, I remember, who said something about Jacques Chirac, the French president, had behaved appallingly because he'd opposed the war. And Tony said, "No, let's get on to the war." You know, that is, it was like
Don't mention the war.
Yes, yes, it was a touch of faulty towers. It was interesting to me because it made me realise that Chirac, who'd always been painted as the leftier of the two, actually had called round Labour MPs to urge them to support the war. And I thought, oh, this is quite interesting. And this was the seeds of what later became my novel, The Ghost. And I guess you would say that was the point.
You're not saying he wasn't.
Yeah, and so I've always liked Tony Blair. I think he has immense gifts and he has charm. But in the end, we're talking about relationships and power. My job was to be a journalist, a writer. That's first and foremost. If you start to think that you're a politician, Moncay, you're finished. I mean, you have to take to a degree, a ruthless view. And so I thought that I would, as I say, I find novels a good way of expressing what I would journalistically write in a column. So I wrote that book, and
Just tell us briefly about the ghostwriter. Two sentences.
For a long time, I'd wanted to write a novel about a ghostwriter because I thought it was a very good way of getting two people talking naturally, and one discovers a lot about the other that maybe they don't want revealed in the biography, so-called autobiography. And so that setup I used, and I had a ghostwriter who goes out to Martha's Vineyard to write the memoirs of a newly resigned Labour Prime Minister.
Tony Blair.
Well, it's not entirely like Tony Blair because the strongest element in Tony's character, I think, is religious belief. And I didn't put any of that in The Ghost. So it's not a total kind of portrait of him, but the situation was very similar.
Did he hate it?
He had never said anything to me about it. He said to my publisher, "Oh, the next time Robert writes a book, tell him to make it up," or something like that, and tell him to find his own character. And Cherie was quite funny because they made a film of The Ghost, and she was her role, the Prime Minister's wife, ex-Prime Minister's wife, was played by Olivia Williams very well, and she saw Olivia Williams at Cherie did at some reception and went up to her and said, "Oh, I've seen you playing me in the film." And Olivia said, "Oh, well, I hope it wasn't too upsetting." She said, "No, I got to sleep with Pierce Brosnan and Ewan McGregor."
Politics. I always think it was probably generally formed quite young. You came from a modest background. Your father was a printer. You were instilled with an intellectual curiosity by him. He was obviously, both of them were rather remarkable with their minds and their ambition and what they thought could be gained through books, learning, hard work.
Yeah.
And they were rather incredibly admirable.
Yes, very much so.
But that formed you very much as a tribal Labour voter.
Well, I think that my father was a bit more complicated than that. I think that, for instance, he voted for Macmillan in '59, but he was certainly a big supporter of Harold Wilson and then of that kind of Jenkins, Callaghan, Healyite sort of wing of the Labour Party. So I certainly grew up, on the left, as it were, naturally voting Labour, or when I couldn't do that, Liberal Democrat. I've never voted Conservative. So that's my area, but I'm not really. I wouldn't say I was tribal.
No, I withdraw tribal.
Because I don't think you can be a writer and be tribal. I mean, you have to be able to see all points of view, which I do, and actually I have a lot of right-wing friends. Actually, that doesn't bother me. Person's politics isn't what drives me.
So if we look at today's politics and today's Labour Party, we've just seen the downfall of Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. Again, friendship, loyalty, power, that triangle of competing forces. What do you think happened, and how does this relate to Roman politics?
Well, I think there is something you can't take personality out of politics. I mean, the left Marxists do try and say that it's all about forces and economic forces and so on, and issues, as Tony Blair used to say. Let's talk about the issues, not the personalities. But in the end, it is very personality driven, and to that degree, is still like the old Roman Empire. And the problem for Starmer was purely personality, I think.
Explain what that means.
I don't think he could get on terms with a lot of his cabinet. They felt he didn't make decisions, and they weren't really sure what he was thinking. And I don't think he was any good at all at the glad-handing side of politics, which is necessary. And nor did he have the ferocity of convictions that a Thatcher had to see something through once he settled on it. So he buckled again and again. He lashed out and fired people. He lost control of the parliamentary party and the cabinet to a degree.
Was Miliband Brutus one of the first to come to him and say, I'm going to force you to go?
We'll have to wait for the memoirs for that, but I certainly think that the several big figures had plucked up the courage to go and see him and tell him he had to go. And the truth of it is, he's long since lost the confidence of the country. And I feel obviously personal sympathy for him, but the system works in a way. I mean, the system works so that actually a guy who was outside all this could stand in a by-election and get at least that measure of support from the people and come into the Parliamentary Labour Party, which almost unanimously then chose him. And our system is whoever can command a majority in Parliament becomes the Prime Minister. And so the system worked. There was a smooth transition of power. And I think that, Burnham will soon run into problems, but I think the change had to be made.
Tell me the problems he's going to run into, and will he last?
Well, the problems are that there's a great deal of discontent in the country, a great deal of upheaval, and everyone, people, you're so exposed now as Prime Minister. I've written about Prime Ministers who could walk down the street, go on a train up to the north of England, sit in a compartment on a railway, and nobody even knew who they were. Now, the security and the constant visualization make it impossible to live a normal life.
But it's judgment in the end, Robert, isn't it? Is he going to have the judgment to make the big calls, as well as with Starmer, who was seen as tripping up the economy, having promised growth?
He reminds me a bit of Harold Wilson. I think he's a deft politician. I think he'll ride the waves very skillfully. Whether he will be able to tackle the fundamental problems in the country, I don't know. Let's give him a chance. He wants to tackle social reform, social care, and let's see if he's able to do it.
What would be your assessment, your sharp acuity on his weaknesses and his strengths?
Well, as so often, weaknesses and strengths are often just the same trait. And in his case, he has a desire to be liked and knows how to make people like him, and he knows how to communicate with people. And this, at the same time, can make him look rather glib, facile, and willing to bend, and he'll say something to get out of trouble in a tight spot, and then he won't be able to follow through. So there will be a process of disillusionment. It seems hard to think that there wouldn't be. You can't name me a Prime Minister that hasn't ended up unpopular. I mean, virtually all of them are thrown out in the end, either by their parties or by the country.
Do you think it was a failure of democracy that the Labour Party couldn't find within their almost 400 ranks an MP who could be Prime Minister and had to go outside to get someone elected? It's pretty unusual.
It's unusual, but as I say, the system did work in a remarkable way, in fact. And Burnham probably is the most experienced man for the job. I mean, he has held cabinet offices before, and he has been the mayor of Manchester. In my view, the greatest mistake that's occurred in my life of covering politics is giving the membership of each party the vote on the leader. It's far better if it comes from within the parliamentary party, so that the electorate is just really basically the MPs. I mean, I wrote a novel, Conclave. It's no accident that the Roman Catholic Church has endured so long by having that system whereby 115, 120 men are locked away and have to come up with a candidate by exhaustive ballot, and they look one another in the eye, and eventually they get someone everyone can agree on. And I think it would be much, if you just look back, we'd have been better served if we hadn't had these crazy votes by party members who are not representative of the country and have landed us with a series of dud prime ministers.
This weekend, we had Trevor Phillips writing about his friendship with Peter Mandelson. They were very, very close at Cambridge. They were best man at weddings and things. The split over the Epstein revelations and also the use of money to gain advantage while in power was, he decided, something which was a beyond friendship, and he ended that friendship. You've known Peter Mandelson a long time. I just wondered if that complication was something which you would like to share. Any thoughts on how you deal with friendship and power when that friendship is not quite as it seems?
Well, it's a very painful subject, personal subject, and one I haven't commented on it at all. And to be honest, I don't want to now. I haven't spoken to him. He hasn't called me or got in touch since he was sacked as ambassador, and so that's where we stand. I mean, I haven't got in touch with him. He hasn't got in touch with me, and I can't say any more than that. I mean, I think that merely that speaks volumes.
It does, and it's because you're a very loyal person, actually, Robert. If I think of your defence of Roman Polanski, who directed one of your films.
Two, in fact.
Two of your films.
Yep.
And that sometimes you find a way to argue that friendship and fairness are sometimes unpopular, difficult things, but are worth fighting for.
Yeah, I mean, I dislike the mob, to go back to the Roman times, hunting people down and tearing them apart in the Forum, and it seems to me increasingly we live in an era of the mob empowered, stringing up Cinna the poet rather than Cinna the politician, and this kind of constant, relentless attack and the joy of the blood sport. There's never a politician forced to resign of either party that I don't always feel a kind of sneaking sympathy with the fox with the hounds all chasing after them. And, that motivated my sticking up for Polanski. I obviously completely deplore his crime, which is now nearly 50 years in the past. And it seemed to me that his victim at that time had forgiven him, and the process by which he'd been tried, or not even tried actually, but the judicial process had pretty well forced him to flee because he'd confessed to his guilt on a plea bargain. But anyway, that's sort of. But I do feel this thing, and I also felt it for Peter when he was forced to resign, particularly the second time as Northern Ireland Secretary, which a subsequent court of inquiry did find him innocent of the charges that had been laid against him. So I don't regret that. I mean, I don't regret taking the side sometimes of people who are under pressure, especially if I know them.
But sometimes, again, with the pause or the ending of the friendship with Mandelson, it's the personal rather than the political, and sometimes not being told things. The omission can be as bad as the commission.
Yes, that's true. And obviously in Peter's case, that is something that a lot of people feel. As I say, I don't want to get into it. I don't want to add to his troubles. It's private, essentially.
Yeah.
But I think, you can guess. I mean, people watching or reading this can guess the state of play. And, it just shows you why it's so interesting to write about power, which is what I've devoted the last 30 years, 40 years to doing. It's this combination of morality, law, power, personal weakness, personal strength, the drama of it, I'm amazed actually that more books aren't written about politicians or have prime ministers or presidents or kings in them, because it's such a mirror to our own time.
Do you sometimes feel the inspiration as well as the exasperation of when you meet politicians? I mean, recently you met Shabana Mahmood, and what was your impression of the Home Secretary from Birmingham, working class background, first women of descent, from a extraordinary clarity of expression?
Yes, I was very impressed with her, and she did remind me of when I first met Tony Blair all those years ago in 1992. Blunt, plain-speaking, clever, charismatic, and kind of talked like a human being, a common sense. And this was very much what Tony was like at the beginning, and I thought she was similar, and she's obviously got a lot of courage, as indeed Tony had, and I wouldn't be surprised if she doesn't end up as Labour's first female leader. She seems to me head and shoulders above most of her colleagues, and I have heard this report that in the end Burnham backed off making a chance of the Exchequer because she's too formidable. I mean, you know, she wouldn't be pushed around. I think he's got a more malleable figure in John Healey. So I'm impressed by her. I think that she's sort of a possible hope for the future, and she's very competent at her job.
Do you fear for the greater, wider landscape about democracy? We talked about the strong men. We talked about executive power sometimes being degraded. We saw Boris Johnson do that with the Tories, probably ruining the Tory party in the process.
Yes, he could have ruined it for a generation.
Do you think? Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Well, because once you start throwing away the rules and you adopt a kind of Trumpian approach to morality and lying and the rest of it, then something goes out of
Was
politics.
he the biggest despair you felt for the Tories?
Well, it's a pretty crowded field, actually, to be honest. I mean, I traced our present woes very much back to David Cameron, actually, because what an un-Tory thing it was to call a referendum on a 52-48 majority to overturn 40 years of foreign policy, having done no planning whatsoever for the outcome. I mean, whether you're a leaver or a remainer, that was a cataclysm. If we were going to leave the EU, we should have had, either should have been someone's manifesto and voted on, or there should have been some kind of royal commission to look at the process and how it could be done. But no, it was just to solve a party problem that he turned everything over. So the rot starts there, in my view. The problems of democracy, I feel this very strongly, are the quality of people now going into politics. I don't knock politicians personally. I wouldn't want to do what they do and grapple with these problems. It's tough. But there's no doubt that it's not a profession now that attracts people as much as professions that make money, or indeed the media or entertainment. And I think that's part of our problem, because I do think the personality affects all, really.
When you look back, we're both able to look back. We're of a certain age, looking back on the quality of leaders, and even when we were very young, there was a sort of still an essence of memory of people being grown up, clever, responsible, authoritative. Is that diminishing, or do you think it's just the landscape?
It is diminishing. I mean, it is diminishing. What a member of that generation that I knew best was Roy Jenkins, a most formidable man. And
just remind us of his positions he had.
Well, he was Home Secretary, the great reforming Home Secretary in the 1960s, probably the greatest Home Secretary for 100 years or more. He was a shrewd Chancellor of the Exchequer. He returned when Labour returned to power in 1974. He became Home Secretary again, and then he stood for the Labour leadership, didn't get very far, left and went to Europe, and then set up a whole new political party. It was an extraordinary career. And just before we started talking, Andy Burnham has given some interview in which he's talked about, the awfulness of, very Prolier-than-thou, about his Labour roots, and rather like Keir Starmer going on about his toolmaker father and all of this rather desperate stuff. Roy Jenkins's father was a miner down the pit, who then became a trade union official for the National Union of Miners and was imprisoned at the time of the general strike. And I remember a Tribune left-wing MP saying, "My God, if that had been my father, you'd never have heard the last of it." You know, but Roy never made anything of it at all. Most people would never have guessed from this rather lordly figure that he portrayed that was what he sprang from. And he was a big figure, and so were Healy, so were Callaghan.
So what do you think of this humble bragging about working class roots?
Oh, I really dislike it, I must say. I mean, as you said at the beginning, I was born in a council house for the first 6 years, lived there. My parents both left school at 14. Now I'm sounding like a Labour politician. I could have done it, couldn't I? Yeah. And I went to Cambridge from a comprehensive school. And as I say, the system worked, you know, for me at least, as it did for Burnham. And I hate this. Labour politicians then turning on the very system that's created them.
When Burnham said he was saving pubs to save working class culture, what was your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I don't think pubs are solely working class. It's so old-fashioned. I mean, I can't believe it plays
very well. Is it worse
than
than that? Is it divisive? What is it trying to do? Because
I think it's obviously trying to ditch reform and to rally the North behind the Labour Party. And according to the polls, it's proven very successful. But I regret it. And one of the great things about Blair was I thought he had taken class out of politics. I mean, he was a public school boy leading the Labour Party. And in a funny way, that seemed like an acceptance by the Labour Party that it didn't matter where you come from, as the cliche goes, it's where you're going. And that seems to have been lost now.
One of the mantras of your new book, which is thrilling, intoxicating, complicated, complex, but the charisma of leadership and power is all-encompassing in its ability to take us through a fast page turner. But does power make monsters of us all? Is one of the taglines of the book.
Yes, well, in the novel, Julius Caesar left behind an illegitimate son with Cleopatra, and Augustus had him quickly dispatched when he conquered Egypt. And he said, "I'm afraid that's one Caesar too many." Yes. And he was a quite innocent 17, 18-year-old boy. And Agrippa observes power makes monsters of us all, because he says, "I wouldn't have said anything if I'd been there at the time." And I think to a degree it's true, because you have to take decisions quite ruthlessly. You have to often drop old colleagues, old friends. And look at the bloodletting there's been in the cabinet just lately with Burnham coming in. And a lot of people will feel that Burnham is a monster, just as a lot of people thought that Starmer was when he fired so many, particularly civil servants. Yes, it's a very difficult thing to become a successful politician and to not turn into a monster. Harold Wilson said that the trick was to learn to take criticism, harden yourself, to absorb it or ignore it, but not to become a monster. And that's a fine line, I think.
Yeah. Robert, thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts on politics today, politics several thousand years ago, and the point at which power, patronage, politics all meet and come to shockingly similar conclusions. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Geordie.